All right. Continuing on our study of the nature of God as creator and following the concepts that we have there, we've talked about the sort of stages in the biblical timeline. If we look at what we typically think of as creation, the world, the heavenlies, all of those things being brought into existence. The tabernacle. The temple, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of first, second temple very much with this. Suffice to say, the temple distinct from the tabernacle. We can look at these as basically the sort of 5 distinct stops, if you like, on the biblical timeline wherein God dwells. Places that he has made his name to dwell, explicitly stating that his intention is to do so, and we see his creative action in this. And we have been speaking for the last several weeks about the tabernacle, and today we're going to sort of move from tabernacle to temple on the sort of we are here timeline on our map or waypoint on our map. This is where we're going. And as we think about the tabernacle and the things that it did, and we've talked about the way we see God's plan, the way we see God's pattern, specifically that he reveals it to Moses on the mountain, and Moses' charge was to see that everything was done according to the pattern, and he does so. He follows through in this. In the garden, post-sin, we find God confronting Adam's sin, don't we? We find God pursuing them in their wickedness, in a sense, saying, "Where are you?" Calling them out, looking for them. At the tabernacle, God is pursuing them in the early initiations of what we might call the process of reconciliation, when he makes a place that they can come together as a people, as he's consecrating a people for himself. By dwelling and moving with them in the tabernacle becomes a physical expression. It becomes an expression of goodness and mercy pursuing us all of our lives. As we read in Psalm 23, "Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So the tabernacle, with its mobility, is pursuing the people of Israel as they move through the wilderness, and then as they move into the conquest of Canaan. His goodness travels with them. His dwelling goes with his people. On the way to the promised land, God pursues his sinful people with his presence. And we've talked about the weight that comes with the tabernacle, the idea of the intensity of the rituals to be observed there, the washings, the sacrifices, the atoning, all of those things that have to be done. I may have told this anecdote before, but a couple of years ago when I was thinking about some of these things and working through it, I mused to my wife, as I sometimes do, and I said, I don't think I would get anything done. I was thinking about my own sinfulness, my own wickedness, how many times I would have to stop what I was doing during the day and go and do one of the, and she said, I think that's kind of the point, actually. The point is to remind them of their need, their constant need for atonement, for forgiveness, for cleansing. And so the visible symbols put into the tabernacle go with that. The tabernacle and its charge is then committed to Joshua to lead the people into the conquest of Canaan. And we reflect for a minute on what that means for them to conquer these lands under God's command. We talked a little bit, as we talked about the structure of the tabernacle and the things we saw there, the similarities that have been found in archaeology to the Egyptian tents, specifically the war tents of the pharaohs having a very similar layout. And that Pharaoh, in theory, was going in the midst of his people, leading them into battle, going to war, and the way they deified Pharaoh and all of those sort of things. And that, in some respect, the tabernacle is an argument, is a rebuttal of that, in the way that it reflects a similarity. It is putting God above all other gods. It is putting God in the reality of those things. The quote-unquote deity of Pharaoh frequently did not go with his people, nor was he always successful in his campaigns. But the charge given to Joshua is that your God is with you. He dwells with you in your midst. He is in his headquarters. He is going to war with his people in this conquest. Additionally, you think about it as a very striking object lesson in some respects for Joshua, isn't it? Joshua was one of the only ones who got to go ahead of time and see Canaan, the time that they were spying out the land. And what were the objections of his fellow spies about Canaan? Why didn't they go in the first time around? City's great and tall. Everything's big. Everything's powerful. We're just this little ragtag band of people that barely made it out of Egypt alive. Joshua then is told to take this quailing people and go in there. He knows what's ahead of them. He's seen it. He's looked at it. But he was appointed to do these things because he had faith, because he had trust. And we see, of course, through the conquest, those times when Joshua relies on the Lord, they prosper. And in those moments when he takes on his own wisdom and considers something well in hand, they get beaten. So, we have the sort of object lesson. Additionally, we're going to see the use, and I think next week, hopefully we'll focus a little more on the use of the other prophets and the psalmists and the other things using these, but we have here in Psalm 96, he says, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the people are idols. But the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and beauty are in his sanctuary." He's asserting God's power, his ability to defeat all of these so-called gods because of his mastery, because he is the one who created all things. Similarly, in Jeremiah, obviously much later in the prophecies, but he says, "Thus you shall say to them, the gods that did not make the heavens and the earth will perish from the earth and from under the heavens. It is he who made the earth by his power, who established the world by his wisdom, and by his understanding he has stretched out the heavens." And so it is the God who made all of these things that is in their midst, that is telling them to go in and to root out those who did not, those who made nothing, effectively, those who in real terms were made by human hands. We come then, as we move here, to the promise of the temple. We have the promise of the temple given to David. Now it came about when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest on every side from all his enemies, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of the Lord of God dwells in a tent within tent curtains." And Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that is in your mind, and the Lord is with you." And we have, of course, the Lord telling David, "Not you, you are a man of blood. It will be your son who builds this house." And we talked a little bit about this idea of the promise and of the direction given by God and the way these things tie in here. We see the building of the temple in 1 Kings 5 through 8. And I'm not going to read all of the specifics, all of the details of the building of the temple this morning. In the building of the tabernacle, and we talked about this fairly extensively, we see God repeatedly, very explicitly bringing Moses, showing him the pattern. We see Moses reiterating the fact that the tabernacle was built according to the pattern, and here is the model. It's actually a little bit buried in the narrative as to the fact that David is given a model, that God, in fact, has his own direction. I was a little surprised as I was going through it that it is not more up front in the construction of the temple, the fact, but we read here, I'm going to read out of 1 Chronicles 28. It says, "David gave to his son Solomon the plan of the porch of the temple, its buildings, its storehouses, its upper rooms, its inner rooms, and the room for the mercy seat, and the plan of all that he had in mind for the courts of the house of the Lord, and for all the surrounding rooms, for the storehouses of the house of God, and for the storehouses of the dedicated things, also for the divisions of the priests and the Levites, and for all the work of the service of the house of the Lord, and for all the utensils of service in the house of the Lord, for the golden utensils, the weight of the gold for all the utensils, and for every kind of service, For silver utensils, the weight of the silver for all utensils for every kind of service, and the weight of gold for the golden lampstands and their golden lamps, with the weight of each lamp and its lampstand and its lamps, the weight of the silver for the silver lampstands, with the weight of each lampstand and its lamps according to the use of each lampstand, and the gold by weight for the tables of showbread, for each table, and silver for the silver tables, and the forks, the basins, and the pitchers of pure gold, and the golden bowls, and the weight of each bowl, and the silver bowls, the weight of each bowl, and for the altar of incense, refined gold by weight, and gold for the model of the chariot, even the cherubim that spread out their wings and covered the ark of the covenant of the Lord. All this, said David, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the details of this pattern. Then David said to his son Solomon, be strong and courageous and act. Do not fear nor be dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you until all the work of the service of the house of the Lord is finished. There's a danger, I think, and I would admit the last couple of times I've gone through Chronicles, I probably went right by this without really recognizing it's kind of in the middle of, all right, you're going through the reiteration of the weights and the golds and the silvers, and David says, God made me understand this. He made me write this down. We talked last week about the idea of the link between God's intention communicating to men his pattern for the tabernacle, his pattern now for the temple, and finally his pattern for the church that he has entrusted to men to be carried out. There's a corollary there with the writing of Scripture, and in fact, David seems to give some hint here that was inspired in some way, perhaps analogously to the Scriptures, in the fact that God made him write this. His writing of it down was a communication from God. And so we have, furthermore, the charge, the command, I think by analogy, that the elders of the church, those who are in charge of the building of God's house in the age in which we live, are to do exactly the same thing that is commanded of Moses, that is commanded of David, that David is charging Solomon with here. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not fail, nor forsake you, until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished. I think you could easily take that up as a charge, as an encouragement for those who are in eldership or in charge of the churches, that he will not fail to build his church. He will not fail. But we must do all according to the pattern that God has displayed, the pattern that he has laid out. Frankly, the pattern that he has communicated to us in writing. We have the plan for it. I'll put in a plug here that if you aren't listening or attending the Thursday night studies, now would be a good time to pick up, because Chuck's taking on that question in large measure, the church in the world, and what is the pattern, the model that is shown. We also talked about this notion that we see here in the promise given to David of rest. That God does not set out to build, God does not do these things either in the tabernacle or in the temple until his people are at rest from their enemies. In the case of the tabernacle, he brings them out of Egypt. He has put down the Egyptians. The threat is behind them, and they have come to a place of some peace, some ability to relax in a sense, at least enough to have built the tabernacle before the conquest begins. And then with David, it is David who finishes. If you go through the history of Israel and follow that down, it can be a little hard to dig out sometimes, but if you read the extents, the description that Joshua is given, this is the land you are to conquer. It is not until David, and it does tell us in 2 Samuel, it helps remind you, but it is not until David that those boundaries and extents are in fact fully secured according to the pattern given to Joshua. The land is finally, according to God's pattern, under David. It is with David that he has given his people rest, and David says as much before the promise is given to him. The Lord has given me rest from my enemies on every side. It is then that the pattern is communicated, the plan is given to him. If we extend that then to the church, it is not until Christ has subjected the powers, the authorities, that he has conquered death, that his enemies are subdued on every side, that he sets out to build the church. Now, just as the tabernacle, just as with the temple, there are still enemies, there are still opponents, there are still things that we face. but there is a major milestone crossed before God says, there is rest, there is space, there is now the proper order and timing for building this habitation, this place wherein I will dwell. I'm going to pick up now with, as we talk about the temple and we hone in on some of its details, G.K. Beale in his book, The Temple and the Church's Mission, says of his thesis, which is that the temple that we see in Revelation 21, the paradise that descends upon the earth, the reason why he conceptualizes that as the entirety of the world, that it is not one specific element. His charge is, in fact, that the entirety of the new earth fits into this. He says the rationale for the worldwide encompassing nature of the paradisical temple in Revelation 21 lies in the ancient notion that the Old Testament temple, where we are, was a microcosm of the entire heaven and earth. So we're going to follow along with him here and see if we agree. Psalm 78, he says, as he's David talking about these things, but he says, chose the tribe that the Lord chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion which he loved, and he built his sanctuary like the heights, or like the heavens even, like the earth which he has founded forever. He also chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. So the charge here is and we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the tabernacle, the idea that those threefold pieces, the pattern that Moses was shown, we're not really told. There's enough ambiguity in the language there to know exactly what that pattern was, whether or not he was shown some kind of model or if he was perhaps shown the original concept and then translated into the tabernacle according to the word God gives to him. But the idea here is that his sanctuary, that again, as we look at this, starting with the tabernacle, the temple, the church, in these three sort of middle elements, God has deemed it appropriate to use the labor of men to build his dwelling. But it is still God who is building his dwelling, unless the Lord builds the house. And so with the temple here, the pattern is shown, that is writing given to David to build it, but it is still God ultimately who is in charge of these things, who is building his temple. Drawing a parallel to the pattern shown on the mountain, and I have to give credit to Aaron for this because it hadn't occurred to me initially, but he mentioned to me after class last week when we see in Matthew 17 what is typically called the Mount of Transfiguration. First couple of verses there, it says, 6 days later Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun. His garments became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. His immediate impulse in seeing the glory of God is, I'll build a place for you to dwell. You know, the word here, tabernacle, don't get held up on that one specifically. It could be translated booths. It frankly could even be translated tents. But the point is, he looks at it and he says, I've got to build you a dwelling. Seeing the glory of the Lord, he is impressed with this. I need to do this. His impulse is to make a dwelling for the Lord. The plan of both the tabernacle and the temple come from the Lord. The thesis then on this, as we follow this down, I'm going to erase this for now. I might regret it. Is that Israel's temple And it's built of 3 parts. That part's not so much a thesis. That part's fact. Those 3 parts correspond to 3 portions of the cosmos. The first one, the outer court. The idea here is that the outer court corresponds to the habitable world, the earth. Nope. The outer court, of course, is where the general population could enter in. It is the least exclusive of the 3 areas. The idea there is that mankind is welcome in this outer court, and mankind dwells here on the earth. The second one being the holy place. And that this corresponds to the heavens, or the visible celestial bodies. And we'll get into the details in just a minute. Meaning, of course, the planets, the stars, the things that we see, outer space. And finally, the Holy of Holies. I'm going to go over here so everybody can see. Corresponding to the invisible realms, the place where God himself dwells. When we think of heaven, hopefully you're not thinking clouds and harps and all that, but that there is some realm beyond what is visible wherein the heavenly host dwells. So this is the idea. This is the outlay, okay? So there's these 3 elements of the temple. We read the description of some of these things here. Nope, I was on it. The argument made for the earth. If we read the description here in 1 Kings of the creation of the wash basin, it is called in the original, in the Hebrew, the word is sea. It is called the sea. It says, "Now he made the sea of cast metal 10 cubits from brim to brim, circular in form, and its height was 5 cubits and 30 cubits in circumference. Under its brim gourds went around it, encircling it 10 to a cubit, completely surrounding the sea. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with the rest. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on top of them, and their rear parts turned inwards. It was a handbreadth thick, and its brim was made like a brim of a cup, as a lily blossom. It could hold 2,000 baths." So this thing is enormous. But it is the sea. As we read again in Exodus, when he initially gives them the command to build the altar for the tabernacle, he says, "You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings, your peace offerings, your sheep, your oxen, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered. I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not make it of cut stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it." So he asks them to find a stone, take out of the earth a stone of the earth. So this is in the outer court, both the sea and the altar. I'm going to put those here as points for us. In fact, in Ezekiel's vision, as he is given these visions of temples celestial, In Ezekiel 43:14, many of your translations will say something like from the ground. Literally, it's out of the bosom of the earth that the phrasing there. So the altar that Ezekiel sees there is literally out of the bosom of the earth, out of the very depths of the ground, this altar is arising. So we see then the sea, the altar, cosmic symbols, and there is evidence, and I'm not going to go through all of these because we don't have time this morning, but if you're interested, G.K. Beale's book is worth reading. He also has a shortened version of it if you want the 150-page version instead of the 350-page version. But he goes through some of the rabbinic and intertestamental writings about the temple and the conceptualization that they had in the mind of Israelites at the time, that these were cosmic symbols. If you want to know more about that, I can go through some of it with you. But the long and short of it is that it was associated in the minds of the Israelites with the seas and with the earth. So you have these two elements, again, corresponding the outer court, the physical world. Again, we read some of it there in 1 Kings, but again, 1 Kings, as he's doing these other wash basins, he made 10 basins of bronze. One basin held 40 baths. Each basin was 4 cubits, and on each of the 10 stands was one basin. Then he set the stands, 5 on the right side of the house and 5 on the left side of the house, and he set the sea of cast metal on the right side of the house eastward toward the south. There's more description further on. I don't think I put it there for you, but you have also on these altars we have, or not altars, sorry, on the basins we have the gourds, lilies, and the basins are supported on bowls. It tells us. So the wash basins are supported on bowls. So you have this idea of life and of lands surrounding the seas. In the mind of those who go in these things, the idea then is you have the lands, the life, the things that we see walking about on the earth surrounding, arranged around the seas, as we do in the visible natural world. 2 Chronicles is describing similarly. He says he made the cast metal sea 10 cubits from brim to brim, circular in form. Its height was 5 cubits and its circumference 30. Now figures like oxen were under it, and all around it 10 cubits entirely encircling the sea. The oxen were in 2 rows, cast in one piece. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing the north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on top of them, and all their hindquarters turned inwards. It was a handbreadth thick, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup. Like a lily blossom, it could hold 3,000 baths. So you have then a very distinct call out of the 4 cardinal compass points, which I don't think is a stretch to suggest the 4 corners of the earth, right? When we read how far is east from the west, we have then the 4 corners of the earth. Nobody can see that through the podium, can they? 4 corners of, with this compass arranged here. The second section then, in the holy place. The inner court or outer space. We see in there the 7 lampstands. The argument made here is that these 7 lampstands correspond to the 7 visible light sources, the 5 planets that are visible from the earth with the naked eye, and the sun and the moon, is the argument made here. Additionally, there's some support there that the 7 lampstands that we see here, I'm going to do it this way. If you cast your mind back to all the time we spent in Genesis 1, talking about lights and the governance that is given to the celestial bodies to govern the passing of time, to govern the light, that God makes the light first and then places it in vessels, we are given a place where it calls out the sun, the moon, the stars. We are also given a place that it just refers to them as lights, seemingly encompassing both the sun, the moon, and the other celestial bodies, just described lights generally. So wrapped up in one word there. In fact, that word is only used 10 times. This description of lights is only used 10 times in the Pentateuch. There is one place in the Psalms where it is used to describe the light of God's presence. Otherwise, besides Genesis 1, it is always in the context of these lampstands, lights.
I think the seven has been traditionally, at least in Jewish and medieval Christian, the seven visible stars, as far as without a telescope.
Right.
You have 5 planets, the sun and the moon.
Correct.
And so it was often seen as representing what was visible to the naked eye, which still is visible to the naked eye, those planets and the sun and the moon.
Yes. Right, so that's the idea, is that the 7 light sources then are corresponding to those 7 visible sources. Additionally, in his commentary on Genesis, Walton, who we've discussed a couple of times, sort of picks this up as his first clue in his argument that the entirety of the cosmos should be conceived of as a temple, a place wherein God dwells, is the correspondence between these light sources and the use of the word light in Genesis. I'll throw that out there. I do think there's a connection for us. We read Revelation chapter 1 as John sees the person of the Lord who is speaking to him. I'm going to read a couple of verses here. I've ellipsed the middle for the sake of time this morning. But in Revelation chapter 1, beginning in verse 12, I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the middle of the lampstands, I saw one like a son of man. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. As for the mystery of the 7 stars, this is the Lord speaking to him, as for the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So we have, again, the Lord very specifically calling out 7 visible lights and holding them up, using them here as the churches there. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the philosopher Vern Poythress. I think I'm saying his name correctly. And we'll probably talk a little more about some of his ideas next week. But in his wrestling with these things, he has this to say. The lampstand is placed on the south side of the holy place. Perhaps this placement is intended to correspond to the fact that from Israel's point of view, north of the equator, the circuit of the heavenly lights would be primarily to the south. That there are 7 lamps correlates not only with the 7 major lights of the heaven, but with the general symbolism of time within Israel. The heavenly bodies were made in order to, quote, serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years, as we've just talked about from Genesis 1:14. The whole cycle of time marked by the sun and moon and stars is divided up into 7s. The 7th day of the week is the Sabbath day. The 7th month is the month of atonement. The 7th year is the year of release from debts and slavery. The 7th of the 7th year cycles is the year of Jubilee. And finally, the lampstand contains the same 7-fold division, symbolizing the cycle of time provided by the heavenly lights. So we have, again, 7, 7, 7. You have the 7 days of the week and so on, which I think is reasonable. Oops, 7 times. I don't think we're stretching our numerology here to suggest that that's a reasonable way to look at these things. All right, let's move into the, unless there's a question there, I'm going to move into the Holy of Holies.
You have a comment on the bread.
On the bread?
Fitting into this paradigm.
I don't have more comment on the bread fitting into this paradigm than I do from what I said out of the tabernacle, the sense of it being hospitality, the sense of God giving some place of importance to the sustenance that man needs to survive, to live, and that it is the priests are invited into God's house to eat that meal on the Sabbath and to fellowship in that way. As far as the cosmic symbols of it, I don't have much to say about the bread in that respect.
Would it be fair to say that the bread then represents an addition, not evident to us in the physical creation? It's the special. It seems to be a special addition to the.
Perhaps. I mean, you could look at it in terms of man in the garden. In the original state, man did not have to work by the sweat of his brow for food. The food was there in the garden provided for him. Not that man did not have work, but it was not cursed the way that we see it now. God had provided everything. In fact, we specifically see him calling out in the Genesis narrative, everything that is there I have given as food for man to eat. And so in this place, it's in the heavens. I don't know what I would do with that on that sense.
I don't think we should think of the tabernacle as just being a model of the cosmos. The point here is fellowship between man and God, and between earth and heaven,
Right.
which represents man and God. So the table of showbread is
The bridge.
table of fellowship. And then you also have the altar of incense,
Right.
which are the prayers of the saints. So you have other elements in the holy place that don't necessarily correspond to the cosmos physically.
Right.
They correspond to the relationship between man and God as you are approaching the Holy of Holies.
So this is the other concept, and we won't have time to go through it today, but the other way to conceptualize or think about these three pieces, I'm going to write it here and then erase it, is if you go from the outer to the holies, it is an increasing scale of holiness, right? That there is a gradation that when you get here, it's very limited exclusive access. We're going to talk about that in a moment, but it is also that as you're approaching, it's getting holier. I think Chuck makes an excellent point, and I appreciate that. Additionally, I would say that to the extent that the incense and the bread and things that we find them in this model is that they're in between. They are between the earth where man dwells and the Holy of Holies. It is in some, perhaps, a bridge.
Tim, another comment to that is in Jacob's dream where he sees the ladder
Mm-hmm.
with the angels ascending and descending. He, in the morning, says, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, like, that was his recognition that God was with him in that place.
Right, was the
And there would be provision made.
provision, right. Yeah, and you know, there's probably a whole other thing to be said about God's provision and the way he provides for his people. I'm going to try to get us in through some of the Holy of Holies. I don't know if we'll get everything today, but we're going to try. So the Holy of Holies corresponding, oops, I shouldn't have done that. The unseen dimension. And don't ask me about the physics, I don't know. So, the correspondence we have here, the first thing that sticks out is the cherubic guard. In Revelation, again, we see in chapter 4, as he's looking on the throne room and we see the Lord seated there in John's vision, he sees these creatures, the cherubim as we understand them, surrounding the throne. The first creature like a lion, the second creature like a calf, the third creature had a face like that of a man, and the fourth creature was like a flying eagle. And the four living creatures, each of them having 6 wings, are full of eyes around and within, and day and night they did not cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and who is to come. And when the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever. In fact, he will go on in that particular vision to describe God's as creator, and we'll come back to that hopefully in next week. We then read, of course, in the description in 1 Kings, I'm not going to read all of this this morning, but suffice to say that in the model, in the pattern given to David to give to Solomon. Those cherubim are there both in the heavens, in the unseen dimension, and he is told to create these, they're like 2 stories tall, these giant gold-laid statues at the entrance. And additionally, we've already talked about those cherubim on the ark itself that are on the cover of the mercy seat. We're told that as the, again, you think about this sliding scale, we're talking about the approach to God. We're told in Leviticus, before we even get here, that incense that the priest is supposed to take with him is not just to perfume his presence. It says, he shall put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat that is on the ark of testimony, otherwise he will die. It is meant to block it out from his vision. He is to approach the throne of God not seeing. Okay, so it is, in some respects, underscoring that unseen dimension. No human is able to enter and look upon the glory. The high priest has to offer this incense cloud. And then the ark, when David stands up and, I've missed it. In 1 Chronicles 28, I thought I had it on here. David, speaking to the people of Israel, he's excited about this vision of building the temple, says, I will build a place for the Lord to dwell, for the Ark of the Covenant, for his footstool. And we talked about that previously, talking about God's dwelling, God's resting, that the Ark of the Covenant is symbolized several places as the footstool. So the Ark, part of God's throne room, the space above it is what? It's empty. There's nothing in it. In this towering space in the Ark of the Covenant, above it is empty. God cannot be seen. There are no images placed there. The invisible God is dwelling there. So it is specifically and symbolically left that way. The Holy of Holies is a representation of God's unseen heavenly dwelling in his temple and amidst the ministering angels and spirits. There's another aspect here, and we may have to pick this up next week, of the idea of reflecting beauty and glory. We see in the command given to make the garments for the priests that God says that these things are for beauty and for glory. And we'll pick this up next week when we talk about the prophets and the way the prophets and the psalmist use these elements and think about them. That there is an extent, and we're going to read in Isaiah 60. I was even thinking about it. I was opening in prayer this morning. He sees the glorified Zion, and yet God is describing people coming, bringing offerings to it, increasing the beauty of that house. There is some sort of magnification of the beauty, magnification of the glory going on. Again, I guess save that for next week, but the question could be asked, why are we doing all this? Okay, so it's a model of the cosmos, so what? I'm going to read a quote from R.E. Clements, another writer who went through some of these elements here. He says, not all of the supposed symbolic references of features of the temple are convincing, but its essential claim that the temple and its furnishings did possess cosmic or naturalistic symbolism must be upheld. Such features were designed to stress the divine power over the created order and to establish the temple as a source of blessing for the land and for the people of Israel. The underlying idea was that the temple was a microcosm of the macrocosm, so that the building gave visual expression to the belief in Yahweh's dominion over the world. We do not need to suppose that every Israelite worshiper was conscious of this, but the temple building signified the cosmic rule of the God who was worshipped there. So the argument is basically this: why do we care that the temple is a microcosm or a model? Is to say that man is dwelling in the world, in outer space, with the unseen dimension around him, and God has placed his temple, I know I'm getting too small for anybody to actually see this now, as a microcosm there. Not to scale. Maybe in Revelation, no. Exerting his dominion outward, even as we have seen his intention in creating it happening inward. And the prophets will make use of this continually. We talked about just a couple of them this morning, but the exertion of God's dominion over his creation and his dominion over all other supposed powers because he is the one who created him. I wish we had time to get to it this morning, but in Isaiah he says, you are the Lord, you willed all these things into existence. Do we think about that as we walk about on the earth? Do you think about that about yourself? Yes, okay, God put natural order into the world, and you were conceived in a natural way and born naturally. But the fact that any of this exists at all, you were willed into existence by God. No less than the world, no less than the stars, no less than all of those visible things. You are an exertion of God's will in your being. If that isn't a cause for us to glorify him, to call upon his name, and to worship him, I'm not sure what is. So let's take that thought and go before the Lord in worship this morning, and I'll entertain any questions afterwards, I suppose. Our Father, we do thank you. We do praise your name. Your will is perfect, and it is awe-inspiring to us to realize we are links in that chain. We are a part of your expression, your will, your glory, your beauty that you have put into existence. Father, we ask that you would light that flame in our hearts, that we would be full of the reality of what you have done and what you are doing and what you will do. Father, we ask that you would perfume our sacrifice this morning, that the incense would rise before you, mingled with our prayers, interceded by the Holy Spirit, an acceptable sacrifice before you, that you would be magnified, you would be glorified, and that we would be fed according to your will and to your way. We ask all of these